The wind was a thief in this part of the Arizona territory. It stole the moisture from the ground, the warmth from a man's bones, and the hope from his heart. Eli McCrae felt it as he cinched the saddle on his last decent horse, a tough buckskin named Dust Devil. The morning air, though cool, carried the promise of another blistering day. Another day the sun would beat down on his parched land and bake the earth into a cracked plate of red clay. He was 34, but the lines around his eyes and the gray streaking his temples told a story of a much older man. His shoulders, broad and strong from years of roping cattle and mending fences, felt heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with muscle. It was the weight of his father's legacy, a sprawling cattle ranch that was now bleeding out, slow and steady, like a gut-shot steer. The rustlers were the first wound. They came in the night, silent and efficient, cutting out a dozen head here, 20 there. They were ghosts who left behind nothing but cut fences and the faint, mocking tracks of shod horses. Then came the drought, a slow, merciless killer that turned his pastures to brown stubble and shrank the creeks to muddy trickles. The McCrae Ranch, once the proudest in the valley, was dying. His hands had seen it, one by one. They had come to him, hats in their hands, their faces etched with apology and regret. They were good men, loyal men, but loyalty couldn't feed their families. They drifted away, some to the silver mines up north, others to bigger ranches that could still afford to pay. Now, only his younger brother, Curtis, and a single old-timer named Jed remained. In the nearby town of Redemption, the whispers followed him like his own shadow. He'd hear them in the general store, feel them in the saloon. "McCrae's finished," they'd say over poker hands and warm beer. "He ought to sell out to Hollister before he loses it all." Thaddeus Hollister was a land baron, a vulture in a tailored suit who circled failing properties, waiting for the final death rattle. He'd made Eli an offer, an insulting pittance that was a slap in the face to the memory of his father. Eli had torn the letter in two without a word, abandoned the land his father had carved out of this wilderness with his own sweat and blood. Never. This land was all he had left. It was the only church he'd ever known, and he would not be driven from it. He swung himself into the saddle, the worn leather groaning a familiar complaint. "Just a few more. Dusty," he murmured to the horse, his voice a low rasp. They must have missed a few. He was heading for the broken canyons to the west, a maze of rock and shadow where the rustlers often drove stolen stock. It was a fool's errand, chasing ghosts on a tired horse. But doing nothing felt worse. Doing nothing was surrender. The sun climbed, relentless and white-hot. The landscape shimmered under its glare. The distant Chiricahua Mountains a hazy, purple smudge against the endless blue sky. Heat radiated from the canyon walls, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and dry sage. It was a lonely world, a world of stark and brutal beauty that had always felt like home. But today, the silence felt different. It was watchful. The usual cry of a hawk was absent, the scuttling of lizards in the underbrush unheard. A prickle of unease traced a line down his spine. He loosened the Colt Peacemaker in its holster, his thumb resting on the worn wooden grip. He rode deeper into a narrow ravine, the rock walls rising steeply on either side, cutting off the breeze. The only sounds were the plodding hoofbeats of his horse and the jingle of his spurs. He rounded a sharp bend, and the world exploded. The first shot came from the ridge above, a deafening crack that echoed off the stone. Dust Devil screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of animal terror and pain, and collapsed beneath him. Eli threw himself clear, landing hard on the rocky ground, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He scrambled for cover behind his dying horse, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard as another bullet whined past his ear and chipped a shard of rock from the wall behind him. He saw them then, 3 of them, positioned on the rim of the ravine, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas. They were not ghosts. They were flesh and blood, and they were here to finish the job. He levered around into the chamber of his rifle and fired back. The shot, a desperate prayer. One of the men grunted and ducked back, but the others returned fire, the bullets thudding into the body of his horse, kicking up dust all around him. They had him pinned, trapped. He was a rat in a rocky cage. He squeezed off another round, then another, trying to keep their heads down. But he knew it was hopeless. They had the high ground, the numbers, the element of surprise. This wasn't about cattle. This was an execution. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, and his rifle clattered to the ground. His arm went numb. Useless. He gritted his teeth against the wave of agony. Fumbling for his Colt with his right hand, he managed to fire once, wildly, before a second bullet slammed into his side, just above his hip. It felt like a mule kick. The world tilted, the blue sky and the red rocks swirling into a dizzying vortex. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps. He tried to raise his pistol again, but his vision was blurring, and his fingers felt thick and clumsy. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard them laughing as they scrambled down the scree slope toward him. He saw a pair of worn boots stop just inches from his face. A shadow fell over him. "Is he dead?" one of them asked, his voice muffled by the cloth. "Not yet," another one grunted. "But he will be. Leave him for the coyotes." A boot connected sharply with his ribs, and a gasp of pain escaped his lips. The laughter followed, cruel and distant. As they faded away, he heard the sound of their horses, growing fainter and fainter, until all that was left was the buzzing of flies and the sound of his own blood dripping onto the thirsty ground. The sun beat down on him. The world went dark. Miles away, hidden in a fold of the mountains where the canyons gave way to piñón pine and juniper, Tessa watched the sun rise. She did not see it as a promise, but as a witness. The sun had witnessed the slaughter of her family. It had witnessed the blue-coated soldiers ride into her village, their rifles firing, their faces blank and merciless. It had witnessed the flames consume her family's wickiup, had heard the screams of her mother and the final, defiant war cry of her father. The sun had seen it all and had done nothing. It just kept rising, day after day, indifferent and eternal. She lived alone now, in a small, hidden shelter built into the side of a rock face, a place her father had shown her as a child. It was a solitary existence, a life of ghosts and silence. She was a ghost herself, the last remnant of a family line erased from the earth by men with white skin and cold eyes. She hunted, she foraged, she survived, and she hated. The hatred was a living thing inside her, a cold, hard stone in her belly that reminded her every day of what she had lost. The men who rode across this land, with their cattle and their fences and their iron laws, were her enemies. They were a plague, a pestilence that had poisoned the rivers and scarred the earth. That day, she was checking her snares near the edge of the foothills when she saw the vultures circling. It was a slow, patient spiral, a dark omen against the bright sky. Curiosity, a trait she usually suppressed for its danger, pulled her forward. She moved through the scrub brush with a silence born of a lifetime spent in these mountains, her moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. She smelled the blood before she saw him. It was a coppery, metallic scent that hung heavy in the still, hot air. Peering over a ledge, she saw the scene below in the ravine, the dead horse, the flies buzzing in a thick cloud, and the man lying beside it, a white man, a cowboy. By his clothes, he was lying in a pool of his own drying blood, his face turned to the side, caked with dirt and grime. Her first instinct was to turn away, to leave him to the fate he deserved, the fate his kind had dealt her people 100 times over. He was one of them. He wore the same boots as the soldiers, carried the same kind of gun. His presence on this land was a trespass, an insult to the bones of her ancestors buried beneath the soil. Let the sun and the coyotes claim him. It was justice. She took a step back, her heart a cold knot in her chest, but something made her pause. It was the stillness of him, the utter vulnerability. He was no longer a conqueror, a threat. He was just a dying man, bleeding his life into the dirt just as her father had. The cycle of violence, the endless killing, it was a sickness that infected everyone, everything. To leave him here would be to feed that sickness. To walk away would be to let the men who did this win. To let death have another victory on this land. A flicker of defiance, the same spirit that had kept her alive when all others had perished, rose within her. She would not let them decide who lived and who died in her mountains. Not today. With a sigh that was more a groan of resignation, she began the difficult descent into the ravine. Up close, he was worse than she had imagined. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale beneath the tan and the blood. One wound in his shoulder was a dark, ugly hole, and another on his side had soaked his shirt in a deep crimson. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Gritting her teeth, she looped her arms under his, ignoring the sticky warmth of his blood on her skin. Dragging him was a nightmare. He was too heavy to carry, so she pulled, one grueling step at a time, up the steep side of the ravine. Rocks bit into her hands. Branches tore at her clothes. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her lungs burned for air. Several times she stumbled, his body threatening to slide back down. But she kept going, fueled by a stubbornness she did not fully understand. This was not compassion. It was an act of war against the fate that had been chosen for him. She finally got him to her shelter as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. The shelter was a small, dry cave, hidden behind a curtain of old juniper trees. Inside, it was cool and dark. She had a small fire pit, a collection of clay pots, and a bed made of woven yucca mats and soft furs. It was a simple home, but it was hers. For the next 2 days, she fought for his life. She cleaned his wounds with a poultice of boiled sage and yarrow, her touch gentle but efficient. He was burning with fever, his body trembling, and he mumbled delirious words she could not understand. She forced water between his cracked lips and bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. She sat with him through the long nights, listening to the rasp of his breathing, the only sound in the vast, silent darkness. In those quiet hours, she studied his face, in sleep. With the hardness gone, he looked younger. There were lines of pain, yes, but there was no cruelty there. Just a deep, weary sadness that seemed to seep from his very pores. On the third morning, he woke up. Eli's first sensation was a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to encompass his entire body. His second was a profound confusion. He was not in the ravine. The light was dim, filtered. The air was cool and smelled of smoke and strange herbs. He was lying on something soft. He tried to sit up, but a sharp agony in his shoulder and side forced him back down with a groan. That's when he saw her. She was sitting by a small, smokeless fire, grinding something in a stone bowl. An Apache girl. Her hair was long and black, her face a mask of stoic concentration. She wore a simple deerskin dress and moccasins. His mind, still foggy from fever and pain, recoiled. An Apache. He instinctively reached for his gun, but his holster was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Had they taken him? Were the men who shot him working with the Apache? Was she his captor? She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no emotion in them, no anger, no pity. They were like deep, still pools of water. She simply watched him, her hands ceasing their work. "Where am I?" he rasped, his throat raw. She did not answer. She just continued to watch him, her gaze unnerving in its intensity. He struggled to sit up again, his muscles screaming. "My guns, where are they?" She gestured with her chin toward the corner of the cave. He saw his Colt and his Winchester, cleaned and lying neatly on a flat rock, far out of his reach. He was her prisoner. Yet, that didn't make sense. If she wanted him dead, she could have left him in the ravine, or killed him in his sleep. He looked down at himself. His shirt was gone. A clean bandage, made of soft cloth and held in place with strips of leather, was wrapped tightly around his shoulder. Another was around his torso. He touched the dressing on his shoulder. It was fresh. The herbs she had used sent a clean, medicinal scent into the air. The realization dawned on him slowly, a fragile light breaking through the clouds of his delirium and suspicion. She hadn't captured him. She had saved him. This Apache girl, a member of a people he had been taught to fear and mistrust his entire life, had dragged him from the edge of death and nursed him back. The sheer improbability of it was staggering. You helped me," he said, the words feeling foreign and inadequate. She gave a single, curt nod, then turned her attention back to the stone bowl. The conversation, it seemed, was over. Eli lay back, his head spinning. He was alive. He was alive because of an enemy. The world no longer made any sense. As he drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, images flickered behind Tessa's eyes, ghosts of a past she could never escape. She was a child again, 10 summers old, hiding in the tall grass on the edge of her village. It was a day of celebration, the day of the corn harvest. The air was filled with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of her mother's laughter. Her father was telling a story to the other children, his voice a deep, comforting rumble. It was a perfect moment, a fragile bubble of peace and happiness. Then the bubble burst. The sound came first, a volley of rifle shots from the trees, a thunderclap that shattered the peaceful afternoon. Screams replaced laughter. The smell of gunpowder and fear choked the air. Blue-coated soldiers poured out of the woods, their faces grim, their rifles spitting fire. She saw her father grab his old lance, his face a mask of warrior's fury as he charged toward the line of soldiers. A desperate, hopeless attempt to protect his family. He fell before he had taken 5 steps, his body riddled with bullets. Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the wickiup. "Run, Tessa! Run to the rocks!" she screamed, her voice tight with terror. But Tessa was frozen, her small body paralyzed by a horror too immense to comprehend. She watched as a soldier kicked in the door of their home. He was a big man with a thick yellow mustache and eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. He was the commander. He raised his pistol. Her mother pushed her, hard, sending her stumbling out the back of the dwelling just as the shot rang out. Tessa ran. She ran without looking back, the sound of her mother's last cry echoing in her ears, a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. From the safety of the rocks, the place her father had shown her, she watched as the soldiers torched the village. She watched the flames consume her home, her life, her world. Later, she would hear the official report. The raid was a defensive action against a hostile band. Her family, her people, were just a footnote in a military dispatch. Her entire world erased and justified with a lie. The memory faded, leaving the familiar ache in its place. She looked at the white man sleeping on her furs. He was the enemy, but he was also just a man, flesh and blood, as vulnerable as her father had been in his final moments. Saving him felt like a small, private rebellion against the cold-eyed commander who had taken everything from her. A few days later, Eli felt strong enough to stand. The fever had broken, and the fire in his wounds had subsided to a dull ache. He was weak, unsteady on his feet. But he was alive. He had to get back to the ranch. Curtis would be worried sick. He had to see what was left. "I need to go," he told her, his voice still hoarse. She was stirring a pot over the fire, the contents giving off a savory, herby steam. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't argue or protest. She simply nodded and pointed to a small bundle near the cave entrance. It was his shirt, washed and mended with careful, small stitches. He pulled on his boots and his patched shirt, the movement slow and painful. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, but he fought it back. He had to be strong. He walked to the entrance of the cave and paused, turning back to her. "I owe you my life," he said, the words feeling heavy and insufficient. "My name is Eli McCrae." She did not offer her name in return. She just watched him with those dark, silent eyes. There was no way to thank her, no words that could bridge the vast canyon of blood and history that lay between them. He gave her a clumsy nod and stepped out into the bright sunlight. The world spun violently. The light was too bright, the air too thin. His legs turned to water, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. The fever, which he thought had passed, came roaring back with a vengeance. He took one step, then another, before his knees buckled. He pitched forward, the darkness rushing up to claim him once more. He didn't even feel the ground as it hit him. Tessa was there in an instant. She had known he wasn't ready. The white man's pride was a stubborn and foolish thing. With a sigh, she half dragged, half carried him back into the cool darkness of the shelter and laid him back on the furs. His body was on fire again, shaking with violent tremors. She did not leave his side that night. She bathed his face, forced more water and broth down his throat, and piled more furs on top of him to fight the chills. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the moon was high and the world was utterly still, he reached out in his delirium and his hand found hers. His grip was surprisingly strong. He mumbled something, a name, perhaps, his voice thick with fevered dreams. She did not pull away. For a long moment, she simply sat there in the flickering firelight, her small, calloused hand held in his. He was the enemy, the embodiment of everything she had lost. But in that silent, shared darkness, as she felt the desperate, clinging warmth of his hand, he was also something else. He was a survivor, just like her. The wall between them, thick with hatred and mistrust, developed its first, almost imperceptible crack. Another week passed before Eli trusted his legs again. When he finally left the mountain shelter, he did so without a word. He woke before dawn, took the mended shirt and his weapons, and looked at the Apache girl as she slept. A still, dark shape under the furs. 1,000 things he could not say crowded his throat. He owed this stranger everything, yet he did not even know her name. He turned and walked away, his stride unsteady but determined, his face set toward the valley below. The long walk back was a penance. Each step sent a jolt of pain through his side, and his shoulder was a knot of fire. The sun beat down, and the familiar landscape seemed alien, hostile. When the ranch finally came into view, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled in a hollow. His heart sank. It looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. It looked like a place already half surrendered to the dust. His younger brother, Curtis, was the first to see him, a stick-thin figure who dropped the axe he was holding and ran, his face a mixture of disbelief and frantic relief.
"Eli, my God, we thought you were dead. We found your horse. The blood."
Curtis was 20, with none of Eli's hardened edges. He had their mother's fair hair and a sensitive mouth that was always threatening to tremble. He had come west a year ago, full of dreams of adventure, but the harsh reality of the territory had stripped them away, leaving behind a raw and anxious fear. Jed, the old ranch hand, emerged from the barn, his weathered face cracking into a rare, gap-toothed grin. "I told him you was too mean to kill, boss." The relief was short-lived. As Eli scanned the corrals, the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. "How many?" he asked, his voice flat. Curtis looked down, kicking at a loose stone. "Another 20 head, maybe more. They came the night after you disappeared, cut the fence by the north pasture. We didn't even hear them." Someone local. Then the thought solidified in Eli's mind, hard and cold as a river stone. The rustlers knew their routines, knew the land, knew the best time to strike. They knew he'd been taken out of the way. It was an orchestrated campaign to bleed him dry, and it was working. That night, the argument that had been simmering between the brothers for months finally boiled over. They sat at the heavy oak table his father had built, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with unspoken grief and frustration.
"You have to see it. Eli," Curtis pleaded, his voice cracking. "There's nothing left. The herd is decimated. The well is nearly dry. We can't afford to hire new men." Hollister made another offer. "It's less than the first, but it's more than we'll get when the bank forecloses."
"We are not selling," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. He stared into the lantern flame, his jaw tight.
"Why? For pride? For some misplaced loyalty to a patch of dirt that's trying to kill us? Father's gone. Eli, there's nothing to prove anymore. We could go back east. We could start over, live a normal life."
"This is my life," Eli shot back, his fist hitting the table with a loud crack that made Curtis flinch. "This land is all I have of him. It's all I have of Mother. Her grave is out there under that cottonwood tree. You want to sell that too? You want to let a man like Hollister plow it under and put up a fence?" "I want to live," Curtis cried, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "I don't want to end up like you, shot and left for dead in some canyon over a few scrawny cows. Is that what you want? To die for this place?" Eli rose slowly, the pain in his side a sharp reminder of how close he'd come to that very fate. He looked at his younger brother, seeing not just a scared boy, but a reflection of the part of himself that was tempted to give up, to let the wind and the dust have their victory. The temptation was a bitter poison, and he spat it out. "This land is all he left us," Eli said, his voice quiet now, but more unyielding than a shout. "I will not be the son who loses it. The discussion is over." He turned and walked out into the cool night, leaving Curtis standing alone in the flickering lamplight, his shoulders slumped in defeat. High in the Chiricahuas, Tessa found that solitude no longer brought her peace. The silence of her shelter now seemed to echo with the memory of the white man's ragged breathing, his fevered whispers. The routine of her days, checking snares, gathering roots, watching the sun's slow journey across the sky, felt empty. His presence had been an intrusion, a violation of the sterile, hateful world she had built for herself. But it had also been a connection, the first human contact she had allowed herself in years. His absence left a void she hadn't expected. A few days after he left, her isolation was broken. She was returning from the small spring where she drew her water when she saw them. 3 Apache men standing near the entrance to her hidden camp. They were not from her father's band. They were strangers, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. One of them held up a strip of cloth, a piece of the bandage she had used on Eli. "You harbor our enemies," the lead man said, his voice a low growl. His name was Kaha. She recognized him now. They had been promised to each other as children, before the world had burned. He was a man now, his face scarred, his eyes holding a fanatic's gleam. He had become a follower of a new chief who preached war and vengeance, who saw any contact with the white man as a betrayal. "He was a dying man," Tessa said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded against her ribs. She placed her water jug on the ground, her body tensing for a fight. "He is a white man," Kaha spat. "His people murdered our families, stole our lands. They herded us onto reservations to starve like penned animals. And you give one of them comfort? You nurse him like a child?" "I chose not to let him die," she replied, her chin lifting in defiance. "The choice was mine, not yours." "You shame the blood of your ancestors," another of the men sneered. Kaha stepped closer, his gaze intense, searching her face. "I remember the girl you were, Tessa. Her heart was Apache. Her spirit was strong. What has happened to you? Has the loneliness made you weak? Has it made you forget who you are?" "I have forgotten nothing," she whispered, the words like stones in her throat. "I remember the smoke. I remember the screams. I remember everything. That is why I live as I do. Alone. I have no tribe anymore. The spirits of my family are my only people." You are betraying them, Kaha said, his voice softening slightly, a note of pleading entering his tone. You are betraying your blood. Come with us. There is a new war coming, a war to reclaim what is ours. We need every warrior. We need you. She looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. The hope he offered was a lie, a path to more bloodshed, more graves. It was the same fire that had consumed her world. Your war is not my war, she said. Leave this place. This is my home. You are not welcome here. Kaha's face hardened again, his eyes turning to flint. Then you are a traitor, an outcast. The next time we find a white man's trace here, we will not be so understanding. He turned, and the three men melted back into the trees, leaving Tessa standing in a silence that was more profound than ever before. Her act of defiance in saving Eli had cost her the last, fragile connection to the people she once called her own. A few nights later, a sliver of moon hung in the inky black sky, offering little light. Tessa moved through the darkness like a phantom, her feet sure on the familiar ground. In her hand, she clutched a small, hard object. It was Eli's whetstone, a smooth, gray stone he used to sharpen his knife. She had found it by his things after he had gone. It was a foolish reason to make such a dangerous journey, to approach the enemy's camp. But it was an excuse, a tangible reason to cover the turmoil in her own heart. She needed to see. She needed to know he had made it back. She needed to close the circle. She reached the edge of the McCrae property and stopped behind a thicket of mesquite. The ranch house was dark, except for a single lighted window. The place was quiet, a sleeping giant in the vast darkness. Taking a deep breath, she slipped across the open ground and crept toward the barn. She would leave the stone on a fence post where he would find it in the morning. That was all. A floorboard creaked on the porch of the house. "Who's there?" The voice was low, tired, but it held a sharp edge of warning. "Eli." He stepped out of the shadows, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He couldn't see her clearly in the gloom. Just a figure standing by the corral. "Show yourself," he commanded. Tessa stepped out of the shadow of the barn into the faint moonlight. She held up the whetstone. "You left this?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. Eli lowered the rifle, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He walked toward her slowly, his boots scuffing in the dust. He stopped a few feet away, the space between them charged with a current of unspoken questions. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough. "It's not safe for you." "I am not safe anywhere," she replied, her gaze unwavering. He was silent for a long moment, just looking at her. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the deep sadness in her eyes. He saw the girl who had saved him, who had demanded nothing in return. "Come inside," he said, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise her. "It's cold out." She hesitated, her body poised to flee, but then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and followed him into the house. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and wood smoke. It was a simple room, dominated by the heavy oak table. Eli gestured for her to sit, an awkward, clumsy movement. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of all the things they could not say. He poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her. She looked at the steaming mug but did not touch it. "There was more cattle stolen," he said, needing to fill the silence. She nodded. "I saw the tracks." He scraped a hand over his tired face. "They want to drive me out." "They will," she said, her voice flat, stating a fact, not an opinion. Her bluntness stung, but he knew she was right. He looked at her, truly looked at her in the warm lamplight. The defiance was still there, a shield around her, but he could see the weariness beneath it. He wondered about her life, about the solitude, about the ghosts that must haunt her. "I lost my mother when I was a boy," he said suddenly. The confession pulled from a deep, guarded place. "Fever took her. This table. My father built it because it was the one thing she wanted.
a proper table for her sons to eat at, after she was gone. He never sat here again. Tessa's gaze drifted over the worn wood of the table. She finally reached out and touched her coffee cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "I watched my mother burn," she said, her voice soft but clear, each word a perfectly shaped shard of glass. "The soldiers, they set our home on fire. She was still inside." The air left Eli's lungs. Her pain was so raw, so immense, it dwarfed his own. It filled the small kitchen, a living, breathing entity. He saw the raid not as a story or a report, but through her eyes, the flames, the smoke, the terror. He saw his own people, men in uniforms like the ones he respected, as murderers. For the first time, he understood the depth of the chasm between their worlds, a chasm carved by blood and fire. And yet, here they were, two lonely survivors sitting at a dead man's table, sharing scars that no one else could see. Eli managed to hire a few hands the next week, drifters passing through town looking for short-term work. They were a rough-looking pair, a lanky man named Walt and a stockier, mean-eyed man named Vic. Eli didn't trust them, but he was desperate for the help. He had seen Tessa a few times since her visit. She never came to the house, but he would catch glimpses of her at the edge of the property, a silent observer in the trees. He started leaving a small sack of flour and coffee by a specific rock formation, and the next day it would be gone. It was a silent conversation, a fragile truce. One afternoon, Vic spotted her. She was standing near the edge of the barn, half hidden in the long shadows of the late day. Vic, who was mending a bridle, stopped his work and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Look what the cat dragged in," he muttered to Walt, just loud enough for Eli, who was nearby, to hear. "McCrae's got himself a little Apache pet." Tessa heard him. Eli saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. Her face, which had been turned toward the house, became a stoic, unreadable mask. She turned to leave, to melt back into the wilderness where she belonged, where she would not be mocked or judged. Something inside Eli snapped. It was a sudden, white-hot rage that burned away all caution, all the ingrained prejudice he had grown up with. He strode over to Vic, grabbing him by the front of his shirt and slamming him back against the barn wall. The wood shuddered with the impact. "What did you say?" Eli snarled, his face inches from Vic's. Vic's eyes widened in fear and surprise. "Nothing. I didn't say nothing, boss." "You will show her respect," Eli growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble that carried across the quiet yard. "That woman has seen more hardship and shown more courage than a dozen men like you. She is braver than any man here, myself included. If I ever hear you speak another foul word about her, I will break your jaw. Do you understand me?" He shoved Vic away. The man stumbled and nearly fell, his face pale. Walt and Jed, who had witnessed the whole thing, stood frozen, their mouths agape. No one had ever seen Eli McCrae lose his temper like that, and certainly not in defense of an Apache. Tessa had stopped at the edge of the trees. She looked back, her dark eyes wide, fixed on Eli. He had not just defended her, he had honored her. He had stood against his own kind for her. It was a gesture so unexpected, so powerful. It shook the very foundations of her world. Later that night, long after the others were asleep, Eli sat by a small fire he had built in the yard. He couldn't sleep. The confrontation with Vic had unsettled him, solidifying a truth he had been avoiding. His connection to the Apache girl was becoming something dangerous, something he could no longer hide or deny. He heard a soft footfall behind him and turned to see Tessa emerge from the darkness. She came and stood on the other side of the fire, the flames dancing between them, lighting the planes of her face. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle and pop of the burning wood. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and soft. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you stay in this place? It has brought you nothing but pain. This land is cursed." Eli stared into the heart of the fire, into the glowing red embers.
He thought of his mother's grave, his father's back-breaking work, the ambush in the canyon, the constant struggle. She was right. It was a cursed place, but it was his curse. He looked up and met her gaze across the flames. It's the only place I've ever bled for. The uneasy truce on the McCrae ranch was short-lived. The departure of Vic and Walt left Eli more short-handed than ever, but the quiet that followed felt like a lie. A week later, the lie was exposed. 10 more head of cattle vanished from a remote pasture, disappearing as if swallowed by the earth itself. There were no cut fences this time, just a gate left swinging open and the faint, scuffed tracks of a single rider leading away from the herd's trail. It was the work of an insider. The realization settled in Eli's gut, cold and heavy. Someone had ridden out, opened the gate, and guided the cattle toward a prearranged meeting point for the rustlers. It had to be one of the new hands, the lanky, quiet Walt, or the mean-eyed, tobacco-chewing Vic. Eli's suspicion fell hard on Vic. The man's eyes were always moving, always calculating, and he held a bitter resentment for anyone who had more than he did, which was everyone. The problem was proving it. A suspicion was just a ghost. He needed to give it flesh and bone, and for that, he needed help. He needed eyes that could see in the dark, ears that could hear the whisper of a footstep on dry leaves. He needed someone who could move through the night without a sound. He needed Tessa. He found her that evening at their silent meeting place by the rocks. He didn't need to explain the whole situation. She had seen the new tracks, had read the story in the dust. "They have someone on the inside," she stated, her voice as calm and certain as the coming night. "I think it's Vic," Eli said, hating the sound of his own helpless anger. "But I can't watch him every minute. I need to catch him in the act." A plan formed between them. Spoken in low, clipped sentences in the gathering twilight. It was simple and dangerous. They would move the last of the herd, what little remained, to the west pasture, making a show of it for the ranch hands. But under the cover of darkness, they would quietly cut out a half-dozen head and drive them to a small, hidden coulee not far from the ranch house. It was a tempting, easy target. If someone was working with the rustlers, they would see it as a final, effortless score. Then, Eli and Tessa would wait. The night of the trap was unnaturally bright, the moon a polished silver dollar in a star-dusted sky. It cast a pale, ethereal glow over the landscape, turning the familiar plains into a world of sharp shadows and bleached-out earth. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the coulee, Eli and Tessa watched. They lay side by side on the cold stone, a rifle propped beside Eli, a long, sharp knife resting near Tessa's hand. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the awkward, heavy silence of strangers from different worlds. It was a shared silence, a comfortable space filled with unspoken understanding. The proximity of her, however, was a slow fire in Eli's veins. He could smell the faint, clean scent of sage that clung to her clothes and hair. In the moonlight, he could see the strong, proud line of her profile, the way her dark eyes scanned the valley below, missing nothing. A desire, sharp and unwelcome, twisted inside him. It was a feeling so complicated, so layered with guilt and duty, that it felt like a betrayal. She was the victim of his people. Her family was dead because of men who looked like him, who believed as he had been taught to believe. To want her felt like another kind of violation, another way of taking something that wasn't his. He was haunted by the ghosts of her past and the crushing weight of his own present. He was a man trying to save his father's ranch, a legacy built on land that had once been hers. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He shifted, putting a few more inches of cold stone between them, and focused on the darkness below. Hours passed. The moon began its slow descent. Just as Eli was beginning to think their trap had failed, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the ranch buildings. A lone figure, moving with a furtive, hurried gait toward the coulee. even at this distance. Eli recognized the man's blocky build. Vic. A low whistle, thin and reedy like a night bird, echoed from the east. Vic whistled back in reply. The trap was sprung. Eli and Tessa moved, slipping down from the outcrop with a coordinated silence that needed no words. They circled around, using the contours of the land for cover, coming up behind Vic as he reached the mouth of the coulee. Eli cocked his Winchester, the sound unnaturally loud in the still night. Going somewhere. Vic? The man spun around, his hand flying to the pistol at his hip, but he froze when he saw the rifle leveled at his chest. His face, washed pale in the moonlight, was a mask of fear and shock. Tessa materialized from the shadows to his left, her knife gleaming, cutting off his only path of retreat. "It ain't what it looks like, boss," Vic stammered, his hands slowly rising in the air. "It looks like you were about to sell me out for a few dollars," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. He stepped closer, the fury he'd been suppressing for weeks finally coiling tight in his muscles. "Who are you working for?" Vic's eyes darted between Eli's implacable face and the silent, menacing figure of Tessa. He licked his dry lips. "Just some fellas. I don't know their names." Eli took another step, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "Try again." The man's bravado crumbled. "Hollister," he choked out. "Thaddeus Hollister. He's been paying me to tell him your movements. How many head you have left? He wants this land. He said he'd make it easy for me. Just get rid of you and he'd make sure I was taken care of." Hollister. The name landed like a punch to the gut. The vulture had not been content to wait for the ranch to die. He had been actively poisoning it. The ambushes, the rustling, the slow, methodical destruction. It was all part of Hollister's plan. The rage in Eli finally broke its leash. He swung the rifle, not firing it, but using the heavy wooden stock as a club. The blow caught Vic square in the jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. Eli was on him in an instant, his hands closing around the man's throat, his world narrowing to the terrified face beneath him. He wanted to crush the life from this traitor, to exact payment for the blood and sweat and fear that had been poured into this dying land. "Eli." Her voice cut through his red haze. It was quiet, but it held the authority of a judge. He looked up and saw Tessa standing over them, her face unreadable in the moonlight. She was not looking at Vic. She was looking at him. Her gaze was not a plea, but a statement, a reminder. Don't become him. He looked down at Vic, who was sputtering and gasping for air, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who had seen his own death. Eli's grip loosened. He took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed himself off the man, stumbling back a step. He had a choice. He could kill this man, drag his body into a shallow grave, and no one would ever know. It would be vengeance. It would be easy. Or he could choose another way. He looked at Tessa, at the silent strength in her face, and saw the difference. Vengeance was a fire that consumed everything. Justice was a harder, colder path. "Get up!" Eli growled at Vic. He hauled the man to his feet and landed a single, brutal punch in his gut that doubled him over, retching. "Take your horse and ride. If I ever see your face in this territory again, I will kill you. Tell Hollister I'm coming for him." He watched as Vic scrambled away, a pathetic, broken figure disappearing into the night. He turned to Tessa. She was watching him, her head tilted slightly, a strange, thoughtful expression in her eyes. She had seen him on the brink of murder and had pulled him back. She had seen the beast inside him, and she had not run. Vic, it turned out, did more than just run. Before leaving the territory, he stopped in the saloon in redemption and, fueled by whiskey and a desire for petty revenge, he told his story. He painted himself as the victim, a poor ranch hand driven out by a crazed boss who had fallen under the spell of an Apache witch. The whispers that had followed Eli now became a chorus of open condemnation. The town, already suspicious of a man who refused to sell out, now had a reason to ostracize him completely. When he rode in for supplies, men turned their backs on him in the street. The bartender at the saloon served him a watered-down whiskey and charged him double, a smirk on his face. Someone spat on the ground near his boots as he left the general store. The town had drawn its line, and he was on the wrong side of it. The final blow came from the bank. Mr. Abernathy, a man with a perpetually worried expression and sweat-stained collars, informed him that the bank was reconsidering his loan. "There are concerns." "Eli," the banker fretted, refusing to meet his eyes. "Concerns about the stability of your operation, about your associations. The board feels your position is untenable." It was a threat, plain and simple. Fall in line or be ruined. While Eli was being pushed out of his world, Tessa had the misfortune of wandering into it. She needed certain herbs that only grew near the creek that ran behind the town. She went in the late afternoon, hoping to go unnoticed, a ghost slipping through the edges of a world that despised her. But she was seen. 3 men, stumbling out of the saloon, their senses dulled by drink and their cruelty sharpened by it, spotted her by the creek bed. One of them was Daniel Miller, the sheriff's lanky, arrogant son. "Well, look what we have here," Daniel sneered, his friends flanking him, blocking her path. "It's McCrae's squaw. Come to town for a bath." Tessa stood frozen, her hand clutching the small bundle of herbs she had gathered. Her heart turned to ice. She knew these men. She knew the vacant, predatory look in their eyes. It was the same look the soldiers had worn. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the fear that was coiling in her stomach. "We just want to be friendly," one of the others said with a wet-lipped grin, stepping closer. "Here you're real friendly with white men." He reached for her arm. Tessa reacted without thinking, her hand flashing out, the sharp edge of her palm connecting with the man's throat. He choked and stumbled back, surprise and pain on his face. The move cost her. Daniel lunged, grabbing a handful of her long black hair and yanking her head back. "Feisty, ain't she?" he grunted. He shoved her hard, and she fell, the herbs scattering in the dust. The third man kicked her, a glancing blow to her ribs that stole her breath. They stood over her, laughing, their shadows falling on her like a cage. "That's enough, Daniel." The voice, cold and hard, cut through their drunken laughter. Eli stood 20 feet away, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, his face a thundercloud of fury. He had been on his way out of town when he'd seen the confrontation. The 3 men sobered instantly. Daniel Miller let go of Tessa's hair and took a step back, a sullen look on his face. "We were just having some fun. McCrae." "Your fun is over," Eli said, his eyes never leaving them. "Get out of here, now!" They hesitated for a moment. Then, seeing the murderous intent in Eli's eyes, they backed away, muttering curses under their breath. Eli waited until they were gone before he went to Tessa. He knelt down beside her, his hands hovering, unsure if he should touch her. She was already pushing herself up, her face a rigid mask, her eyes burning with a humiliation that was worse than any physical pain. A dark bruise was already forming on her cheekbone. Without a word, she gathered her scattered herbs and stood up, refusing to look at him. She started to walk away, back toward the mountains, back to her world of silence. "Tessa, wait!" he called after her. She didn't stop. Eli's rage, which had been simmering for weeks, finally exploded. He didn't follow her. He turned and strode toward the sheriff's office, his boots pounding a furious rhythm on the dusty boardwalk. He slammed the door open. Sheriff Miller, a portly man with a drooping mustache, looked up from his paperwork. Startled, "Your son and his friends just assaulted a woman down by the creek," Eli said, his voice shaking with a fury he could barely control. The sheriff's face hardened. He stood up slowly. "My son says he was provoked. He says an Apache woman attacked one of his friends for no reason."
That's a lie, and you know it. Eli spat. I saw what happened. And who is the town going to believe? McCrae? The sheriff asked, his voice laced with menace. You, the man who's harboring one of them on his land, or my boy? He leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. Let me give you a piece of advice. This is my town. I keep the peace here, and that girl is a threat to that peace, as long as she is on your land. I cannot guarantee her safety. The law will not protect her. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Eli stared at the sheriff, at the smug certainty on his face. He understood perfectly. There was no justice to be found here. Not for Tessa, not for him. He was powerless. He turned without another word and walked out, the feeling of utter helplessness, a bitter acid in his throat. He found her in the barn that night. She was sitting in the hayloft, staring out the open door at the moonlit plains, a solitary, wounded figure. He climbed the ladder slowly. She didn't turn as he approached and sat down a few feet away from her. The candle he carried cast a warm, flickering glow in the vast, dark space. He held out a small bowl of water and a clean cloth. Let me, he said softly. She finally looked at him, her eyes guarded. After a long moment, she gave a stiff, reluctant nod. He moved closer, dipping the cloth in the water and gently dabbing at the bruise on her cheek. His touch was hesitant, careful. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a coyote and the soft sound of the cloth on her skin. He finished cleaning the cut, his movements slow and deliberate. As he pulled his hand away, she reached out and her fingers brushed against his chest, tracing the line of an old scar he'd gotten from a longhorn's horn years ago. Her touch was light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through him. You have suffered, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the scar. Then she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his, and her voice was filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have no bottom, but not like me. The truth of her words hung between them, stark and undeniable. His pain, his struggles, his fears, they were real. But they were the wounds of a man fighting for a piece of the world. Her pain was the wound of a woman whose world had been stolen and burned. He looked at her bruised face, at the infinite sadness in her eyes, and the last of his resistance crumbled. The guilt, the duty, the fear, they were all still there. But beneath them was something stronger, something that demanded to be acknowledged, a profound, aching connection to this woman who had saved his life, who understood survival in a way he never could. He lowered his head, his breath warm on her face. Then show me, he murmured, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of shared pain. It was hesitant, a question asked in the dark. It was raw, the taste of dust and tears and blood. And it was deep, a desperate attempt to bridge the unbridgeable chasm between them. A silent promise made in the candlelight of a lonely barn, under a vast and indifferent desert sky. That first kiss in the barn did not break the dam of their loneliness, but it opened a crack through which a hesitant, fragile stream could flow. Their relationship began there, in the quiet darkness of the hayloft, a secret kept from the sleeping ranch and the judging eyes of the world. It was a thing of unspoken needs and profound, aching tenderness, a stark contrast to the brutality of the land around them. It was both tender and rough, a reflection of the two souls involved. There were moments of fierce, desperate passion, a raw coming together of two people who had been starved of touch and comfort for so long. In these moments, they were not a white man and an Apache woman, but simply a man and a woman seeking solace from the ghosts that haunted them. But there were also long periods of quiet, of simply lying together in the hay, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. He would tell her stories of his childhood, of learning to ride on a pony his father had bought him, and she would listen, her silence a deep and absorbing thing. She rarely spoke of her own past, but in the safety of the darkness, she allowed herself to be held, a silent admission of the wounds she carried. For Tessa, this new intimacy was a minefield.
She was drawn to Eli's quiet strength, to the surprising gentleness in his calloused hands, to the way he looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was turning to dust. She had spent years building walls around her heart, fortifying them with hatred and grief. Eli had breached those walls without trying, simply by being a man who chose justice over vengeance, kindness over cruelty. But a part of her remained terrified, a wild, cornered animal that could not bring itself to trust this strange new shelter. She would watch him sometimes as he worked, his brow furrowed in concentration as he mended a piece of tack or planned his next move against Hollister. She saw the immense weight he carried, the burden of his legacy and his imminent failure. She feared she was just another burden, another wound he was trying to heal to make himself feel whole. Was his tenderness for her, or was it for the idea of her? Was he trying to save the Apache girl to atone for the sins of his people? The thought was a poison, creating a distance between them even as they lay in each other's arms. She would pull away, her body tensing, and he would feel the shift, the sudden coldness, without understanding its source. Eli, for his part, was drowning in a sea of guilt. Every time he touched her, every time he looked into her dark, sorrowful eyes, he was reminded of the chasm between them. He was a McCrae, a name that had been carved into this land with an axe and a plow and a rifle. His ancestors, like all the others, had taken this land. They had been part of the relentless tide that had swept her people away, that had destroyed her family and left her an orphan in her own home. How could he love her? The question was a constant, tormenting refrain in his mind. To love her felt like the ultimate act of hypocrisy. It felt like a conqueror claiming his final prize. He saw the ghosts of her ancestors in the shadows, their accusing eyes following him. He saw the face of the blue-coated commander from her stories and saw his own reflection. His love for her was tangled inextricably with the shame of his heritage. Sometimes, the guilt was so strong it made him physically ill. He would become distant, his words clipped, his touch hesitant. He was terrified that his love, born of a genuine and desperate connection, would ultimately be just another white man's cage for her. One cool evening, they sat together in the hayloft, the scent of dry hay and old leather thick in the air. A lantern cast a single pool of golden light, leaving the corners of the vast space in deep shadow. Eli was cleaning his rifle, the methodical, repetitive motion a way to occupy his hands and quiet his mind. Tessa was stitching a tear in his shirt, her movements small and precise. "You are quiet tonight," he said, not looking up from his work. "You are always quiet," she countered, her voice soft. He stopped his work and looked at her. "Something's wrong." She put the shirt down and met his gaze. There was a vulnerability in her eyes he had rarely seen before. "There is something I have never shown anyone," she said. She stood up and, turning away from him slightly, she unlaced the side of her deerskin dress, pulling the garment aside to reveal the skin of her hip. There, embedded in the flesh just below the line of her hip bone, was a small, dark, ugly lump. The skin around it was puckered into a pale, jagged scar. "From the raid," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A piece of a bullet. It went in, but it never came out. Sometimes, when the air is cold, it aches. It reminds me." Eli stared at the fragment. A piece of lead that had been fired from a white man's gun. A piece of metal that had torn through her home and her family and had come to rest in her own body. It was a physical manifestation of all his guilt, a permanent testament to the brutality she had endured. He felt a wave of nausea and self-loathing so intense it almost buckled his knees. He stood up and came to her, his movements slow, as if approaching a sacred, wounded thing. "We can take it out," he said, his voice thick. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Can you?" she asked. It was not a question about his skill, but about his heart. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I can." He brought the lantern closer and had her lie down on a clean horse blanket. He sterilized the tip of his sharpest knife in the lantern's flame. his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it steady. This was a desecration and a sacrament all at once. He was touching the most profound evidence of her wound, a wound his people had inflicted.
"This will hurt,"
he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I am used to it," she replied, her eyes closed, her face a stoic mask. He took a deep breath and made the small, careful incision. His hands, usually so steady with a rope or a rifle, felt clumsy and foreign. Tessa did not flinch, did not make a sound, though he saw the muscles in her jaw tighten. With the tip of the knife, he worked the small, flattened piece of lead free from the tissue that had held it for a decade. It came loose with a small, sickening pop. He held it in his palm, a tiny, misshapen piece of metal that carried the weight of a world of pain. Blood welled up from the small cut, startlingly red against her skin. He dropped the fragment as if it had burned him and quickly pressed a clean cloth to the wound. His whole body was shaking. He had not just removed a piece of metal from her body. He had touched the very core of her trauma, and it had nearly broken him. He looked down at her. Her eyes were open, and they were filled with tears. He had never seen her cry before. He gently wiped the tears from her cheek with his thumb, and in that moment, the guilt and the shame receded, replaced by a love so fierce and protective it felt like it could shatter his ribs. The outside world, however, had not forgotten them. Kaha had not forgotten her. He and 2 other warriors found her one morning near the spring. They did not carry the open hostility of their last meeting, but a grim, formal purpose. Kaha carried a talking stick, a sign that he spoke for their council. "The elders have spoken," he said, his face carved from stone. "They say a daughter of the people cannot lie with the enemy and still be a daughter. They say you have chosen the white man's blanket over your own. This is the last time we will ask. Renounce him. Come back to us. Be one of us again, or be nothing to us at all." It was an ultimatum, a final, brutal choice. To go with him would be to return to a life of righteous hatred and slow decline, to be a part of a people who now saw her as tainted. To stay would be to sever the last thread connecting her to the memory of her family, to her very identity. She looked at Kaha, at the zealot's fire in his eyes, and she saw the same endless cycle of vengeance that had left her an orphan. It was a path that led only to more graves. She thought of Eli, of his tormented guilt, of his trembling hands as he removed the bullet fragment. His world was full of poison, but with him, she had found a small, quiet space to breathe. "I have no tribe anymore," she said, her voice clear and final. "My people are dust. Their ghosts are my counsel, and they do not tell me to hate." Kaha's face contorted with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Then you are dead to us," he said, his voice hollow. "You are a ghost, just like them." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate shunning, and the 3 men disappeared into the trees. She was utterly alone now, an outcast from both worlds. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath, but beneath it was a strange, hard clarity. She had made her choice. She had not chosen Eli over her people. She had chosen a future, however uncertain, over a past that was nothing but pain. She did not go back to her shelter. She went to the ranch. She found Eli by the corral, his face grim as he stared out at his dwindling land. He looked up as she approached, a question in his eyes. She stopped before him and said, "You owe me nothing, but I stayed." Eli understood. She was not his responsibility. She was not his to save or protect. She was her own woman, and she had chosen to stand with him. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and certain. For the first time, his love for her felt not like a source of guilt, but like a source of strength. The strength was needed, for their enemies were closing in. A few days later, Thaddeus Hollister rode up to the ranch, flanked by 2 hired men with rifles resting on their saddles. Hollister was a man who looked soft, with a round belly and pale, manicured hands.
but his eyes were as cold and dead as a snake's. "McRae," he said, his voice smooth and oily. He did not dismount. "I am here to make my final offer. I am a generous man. I will give you $500 for this pathetic piece of rock and dust, enough to get you and your brother back east where you belong. This ranch isn't for sale." "Hollister," Eli said, his hand resting near his Colt. Hollister smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "Everything is for sale. My friend, it is just a question of price. I have been patient. I have tried to persuade you, but my patience has run out. If you do not accept my offer by the end of the week, the attacks will escalate, fences will be cut, wells will be fouled, buildings will burn. The sheriff, as you may have noticed, is a very dear friend of mine. The town council, too. They all agree that this valley would be better off under a single, stable management. Mine." The threat was naked, arrogant. Hollister was admitting to everything, confident in his power, in the network of corruption he had woven around the town. Eli was truly alone, an island in a sea of enemies. "Get off my land," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "As you wish," Hollister said with a theatrical sigh. "But remember what I said, the end of the week." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his threats hanging in the air. The end of the week came 2 days early. It came in the middle of the night, announced by a sudden hungry roar and the terrified screaming of horses. Eli was jolted from a light sleep, the room filled with a flickering, hellish orange light. He ran to the window and his heart stopped. The barn was a towering inferno, flames leaping high into the night sky, devouring the old, dry wood. "Curtis, get the water buckets," he yelled, pulling on his boots. "Tessa!" She was already there, a silhouette against the fire, her knife in her hand, the few remaining ranch hands. Jed and Curtis were running in a panic, their efforts with the water buckets laughably futile against the raging blaze. "The horses!" Eli shouted over the roar. The last of his father's prized stock, 6 horses, were trapped in the corral adjoining the barn, their eyes wide with terror as the flames licked closer. He and Tessa ran for the corral, the heat so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin from their faces. The gate was jammed. Eli threw his shoulder against it, again and again, the wood groaning but refusing to budge. "The rails!" Tessa cried, and began hacking at the leather straps holding 2 of the fence rails in place. Eli joined her, his own knife a blur. They managed to free the rails, creating a narrow opening. "Go! Get!" Eli yelled, waving his arms, trying to drive the panicked animals through the gap. One horse bolted through, then another, but the others, crazed with fear, just circled and screamed. A section of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timbers. One of the fiery beams fell across the opening they had made. Suddenly, Tessa darted past him, into the corral. "No!" Eli screamed, but she was already inside, her voice a low, calming chant as she grabbed the bridle of the lead mare. She pulled, her small frame straining, trying to lead the terrified animal away from the fire. As she passed near the burning barn wall, a cascade of sparks and embers rained down. A flurry of them landed in her long, black hair. In an instant, it ignited, a horrifying crown of fire. She cried out, a sharp sound of shock and pain. Stumbling back, Eli moved without thinking. He tore off his heavy canvas coat and lunged, tackling her to the ground, wrapping the coat around her head and smothering the flames with his own body. He held her tight for a second, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of burnt hair acrid in his nostrils. "Are you all right?" he yelled, his voice hoarse. She nodded, pushing herself up, her eyes wide but her face determined. "The horses," she gasped. Together, they managed to drive the last of the animals out into the open pasture, away from the inferno. They could do nothing but watch as the fire consumed everything. The barn, the structure his father had raised with his own hands, The heart of the ranch collapsed into a heap of glowing embers. They were alive, but only just. As the dawn broke, a gray, cheerless light crept over the scene of devastation. The barn was gone, a smoking, blackened skeleton. The cattle, spooked by the fire, were scattered across the valley. And when Jed went to the well, he returned with a face ashen with despair. "It's poisoned, boss," he said, his voice breaking. "They dumped something foul in it. The water's ruined." It was the final, killing blow. No barn, no cattle, no water. The ranch was dead. Eli sank to the ground amidst the ash and charred wood. The fight finally gone out of him. He stared at the ruins of his life's work, the ruins of his father's dream. He had failed. Hollister had won. Tessa came and sat beside him in the gray morning light. She was covered in soot, and a section of her hair was a ragged, blackened mess. But she was alive. She was here. She looked at the smoking ruin of the barn, then at his face, which was a mask of utter desolation. "You lost everything," she murmured, her voice soft with a sorrow that was for him. He was silent for a long time, the gray ash swirling around them in the morning breeze. He looked at the devastation, at the end of everything he had ever fought for. Then he turned and looked at her, at the woman who had faced down his world and her own to stand beside him. "Not everything," he said. The numbness of despair lasted less than a day, burned away by the cold, hard fury that took its place. As Eli stood over the poisoned well, the stench of chemicals and decay rising in the morning heat, something inside him finally broke. The fight for the ranch was over. Now, the fight was for retribution. He had lost his legacy, his home, his future. All that was left was a debt to be paid in blood. He walked to the shell of the ranch house, his movements stiff and deliberate, the movements of a man who had been hollowed out and filled with a single, terrible purpose. He took his Colt from the holster hanging on his bedpost, checking the action, the weight of it in his hand, a familiar, grim comfort. He strode to the small chest where his father had kept his spare ammunition and began methodically loading the empty chambers. Curtis found him there, his young face pale with fear. "Eli, what are you doing?" "I'm going to see Hollister," Eli said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He didn't look at his brother. "You can't," Curtis pleaded, grabbing his arm. "You ride into town like this, they'll kill you. Hollister owns the sheriff, he owns everyone. It's suicide." Eli pulled his arm away, his gaze as cold and gray as the ash outside. "He took everything. He's not going to get away with it." He turned to leave, but a figure blocked the doorway. It was Tessa. She had been watching him, her dark eyes filled with a sad understanding. She knew this look. She had seen it on the faces of Apache warriors preparing for a raid from which they knew they would not return. It was the look of a man who had embraced his own death. "This is not the way," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Get out of my way, Tessa," he said, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol. She did not move. "Vengeance is a fire," she said, her voice echoing the words she had spoken to him once before. In the moonlight, after he had beaten Vic, "It will burn you down to the bone. It will not bring back your father's barn. It will not make the water clean. It will only feed the fire Hollister started." "He needs to pay," Eli snarled, the words torn from his throat. "He will," she said, "but not with your death. You kill him, and his friends will hang you before sunset. Nothing will change. His poison will still run this valley. You need to expose him. You need to cut out the rot, not just chop off the head of the snake." He stared at her, the rage warring with the cold, hard logic of her words. She was right. Killing Hollister would be a satisfying, final act, but it would be a fool's errand. It would accomplish nothing but his own destruction. Tessa was not asking him to forgive, but to fight smarter, to use his head, not just his gun. "How?" he asked. The single word a concession, a surrender of his rage to her wisdom. "A man like Hollister is greedy," she said. Greedy men are careless. They leave a trail. Deeds, letters, bank drafts, proof of his deals. It will be in his office or at the bank. I can't get near either place, Eli said, the reality of his situation crashing back down on him. They'd arrest me on sight. Tessa's gaze was steady. You can't, but I can. The idea was insane. A lone Apache woman sneaking into the heart of a hostile town, into the office of the most powerful man in the valley. But as he looked at her, at the quiet determination on her face, he knew she could do it. She could move through the shadows in a way he never could. That night, under the cover of a moonless, starless sky, Tessa slipped into the town of Redemption. She was a ghost, a whisper of movement in the alleyways. She found the land office where Hollister conducted his business, a small brick building on the main street. The back window, as she had suspected, was old and poorly fitted. With the tip of her knife, she carefully worked the latch free and slid the window open, slipping inside without a sound. The office smelled of stale cigar smoke and money. By the faint light filtering in from the street, she searched. She moved with an innate sense of purpose, her fingers gliding over ledgers and stacks of paper. In a locked drawer of the main desk, she found what she was looking for, a thin leather portfolio. Inside were signed contracts, promissory notes, and a ledger detailing payments made to a half-dozen men in town, including Sheriff Miller and 2 members of the town council. It was a meticulous record of Hollister's conspiracy, a roadmap of his corruption. She took the entire portfolio, tucked it inside her dress, and slipped back out the window, vanishing into the night as silently as she had come. The confrontation came the next afternoon. Eli rode into town, not with a gun drawn, but with the leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Tessa was with him, riding one of the horses she had saved from the fire. She rode tall and proud, her presence a silent act of defiance. Their arrival stopped the town in its tracks. Men on the boardwalk stopped talking, their faces a mixture of surprise and hostility. Eli dismounted in front of the saloon, the place where the town's power brokers, Hollister included, gathered every afternoon. He tied his horse to the hitching post and turned to Tessa. Stay here, he said. I am not a child to be left behind, she replied. Swinging down from her horse, she stood beside him, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Together, they pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon. The room went silent. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. Every eye turned to them. Hollister was at a back table, playing cards with Sheriff Miller and 2 other men. He looked up, a flicker of surprise followed by a smug, confident smile. McCrae, Hollister said, leaning back in his chair. I thought I told you to be off your land by now. Have you come to your senses? Eli walked toward the table, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He tossed the leather portfolio onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy slap, scattering the playing cards. I've come to collect a debt. Hollister. Hollister's smile vanished. He recognized the portfolio. His eyes widened in panic, then narrowed in fury. He looked from Eli to Tessa, who stood near the door, a silent, watchful guardian. He understood instantly what had happened. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Hollister hissed, his voice low and venomous. He made a small, sharp gesture with his hand. The 2 men who had been with him at the ranch, his hired guns, materialized from the corners of the room. They had been waiting. They drew their pistols. At the same time, Sheriff Miller slowly pushed his chair back, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. The saloon exploded into a maelstrom of violence. Eli kicked the table over, sending it crashing into Hollister and the sheriff. He drew his Colt, firing as the first of Hollister's men raised his pistol. The man grunted and fell back, clutching his shoulder. Tessa moved with the speed of a striking snake. As the second gunman turned his weapon on Eli, she threw her knife. It spun end over end, a flash of silver in the dim, smoky light, and embedded itself in the man's gun arm. He screamed and dropped his weapon. A bullet whined past Eli's ear, fired by the sheriff. Eli returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to disarm. His shot hit the wall just inches from Miller's head, sending a shower of plaster and splinters into his face. The sheriff yelped and ducked for cover. Suddenly, a searing pain sliced across Tessa's side. She cried out and stumbled back against the wall, her hand flying to her ribs. One of the other men at Hollister's table, a town councilman, had drawn a small derringer and fired. Blood was already seeping through her fingers. Seeing her hit, seeing her pain, broke the cold control Eli had been holding on to. The tactical, disciplined fighter vanished, and the raging, vengeful man he had been that morning returned with a vengeance. A red haze descended over his vision. He forgot about the documents, forgot about justice. All he saw was Hollister, scrambling to his feet, trying to escape through the back door. Eli lunged, tackling Hollister and sending them both crashing through a table. He was a wild animal, his fists rising and falling, connecting with Hollister's soft face with brutal, sickening force. He was going to kill him, to beat him to a pulp on the floor of this corrupt, filthy saloon. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a small hand, but its grip was surprisingly strong. "Eli, don't—" It was Tessa's voice, strained with pain, but clear and urgent. "Don't become him!" The words pierced through his rage. He looked down at the bloody, terrified face of Hollister, then looked at his own bloody knuckles. He was a breath away from becoming the very thing he despised. A monster who solved his problems with violence and death. He took a shuddering breath and pushed himself off Hollister, who lay on the floor, whimpering. Just then, the saloon doors burst open. The town blacksmith, a burly man named Peterson, stood there, his face grim. "Hollister's men are trying to set fire to the general store," he yelled. That was the final straw. The townspeople, who had been watching the chaos with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, were finally pushed too far. This was no longer about a dispute with an outcast rancher. Hollister's fire had threatened them now, their homes, their businesses. A mob of angry citizens, led by Peterson, surged out of the saloon. They caught Hollister's last remaining man with a torch in his hand and a can of kerosene at his feet. The tide had turned. With his hired guns wounded and his allies in the town turning on him, Hollister was finished. Eli, his breath still coming in ragged gasps, retrieved the portfolio. He walked over to the cowering Sheriff Miller and threw it at his feet. "This is for the town council," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "Let them see who they've been in business with." He went to Tessa, his fury replaced by a cold, sharp fear. He gently pulled her hand away from her side. The bullet had only grazed her, a long, bloody furrow along her ribs, but it was deep. "We need to get this cleaned," he said, his voice tight. In the end, justice, or something like it, was served. Faced with the undeniable proof in the ledger and the fury of the townspeople, the council had no choice. Hollister and the sheriff were arrested and held for the federal marshal. The land grab was over. Eli had won. But it was a hollow victory. As he stood before the hastily assembled town council, a bandage visible under his own torn shirt, he was not met with gratitude, but with a cold, grudging respect. The mayor, a man whose name was in Hollister's ledger, cleared his throat. "You have done this town a service, Mr. McCrae," he said, his tone formal and distant. "But let us be clear, your methods were unorthodox, and your association with that woman will not be forgotten. You will always be tainted by it. You are welcome to stay, of course, but do not expect to be welcomed." The message was clear. He had saved them from a wolf, but in their eyes, he had done it by colluding with a different kind of predator. He would never be one of them again. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard, thankless work. He buried Jed, the old ranch hand who had caught a stray bullet in the saloon fight.
He and Curtis worked from sunup to sundown, rebuilding the burned corral, trying to round up the scattered cattle, and clearing the poisoned well. Neighbors did not offer help. The town did not offer support. They were on their own, an island of pariahs. One afternoon, he came back to the house, exhausted and covered in grime, to find Tessa packing a small bundle. It contained a few dried herbs, a water skin, and the knife he had given her. A cold dread seized him. "What are you doing?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She did not look at him. She kept her focus on her task, her movements neat and efficient. "I am leaving," she said, her voice quiet. "Leaving? Where will you go?" "Back to the mountains," she said. "Back to my home." "This is your home," he said, the words coming out with more force than he intended. She finally looked up at him, and her eyes were filled with a profound, unshakable sadness. "No, Eli," she said gently. "This is your home. My time here, it was never meant to last. Your world has no place for me. You saw it in their faces. I will always be the outsider, the savage. And as long as I am here, you will be too." She was right, and the truth of it was like a knife in his gut. She was giving him back his life, his world, at the cost of her own happiness. She was sacrificing herself so that he might one day be accepted again. "They will never accept you while I am here," she repeated. "You need to rebuild. You cannot do that with a ghost tied to your ankle." She finished her bundle and walked to the door. He stood there, frozen, watching his entire world prepare to walk away. He had fought and bled and nearly died for this patch of dirt, this legacy of his father's. But as he watched her walk away, he realized that the land meant nothing. The legacy was just dust and bone. She was the only thing that was real, the only thing that mattered. She paused at the door, her back to him. He thought she would leave without another word. But then he spoke, his voice clear and certain in the quiet room. A single sentence that changed everything. "Then I'll leave mine behind." Tessa's words hung in the quiet, dusty air of the ranch house. A sentence that was both a promise and a declaration of war against the world that had tried to tear them apart. For Eli, they were the only words that mattered. The ranch, the legacy, the town. It was all a ghost limb, an ache for something that was already gone. He looked at Curtis, who stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of bewildered anguish. "I'm giving it all to you, Curtis," Eli said, his voice steady. "The deed, the brand, what's left of the stock, it's yours. Do what you want with it. Sell it to Hollister's successors. Burn it down for all I care. It's just land." "Eli, you can't be serious," his brother stammered. "This is your life. It was Father's life." "No," Eli said, turning his gaze to Tessa, who waited by the door, her expression unreadable. "She is my life now." There were no more arguments. Curtis saw the finality in his brother's eyes, a resolve as hard and unyielding as the mountains themselves. He simply nodded, a silent, heartbroken acceptance. Eli took nothing but his rifle, a bedroll, and one of the horses Tessa had saved from the fire. He and Tessa rode out of the ruined ranch yard without looking back, two solitary figures heading north, toward the jagged peaks of the Chiricahuas that scraped against the deep blue sky. They found a place high up in a hidden pass, a place Tessa had known since she was a child. It was an old line cabin, long abandoned by prospectors, nestled in a grove of tall pines that whispered secrets to the wind. The air was thin and cold and clean, and from their vantage point, they could see the entire valley spread out below them like a map. The hated town of Redemption, a tiny, insignificant smudge in the distance. For a time, it was a reprieve, a fragile peace in a world that had offered them none. They lived a simple, elemental existence. Eli hunted, his skills providing them with venison and rabbit. Tessa foraged, her knowledge of the mountain yielding roots, berries, and herbs for medicine. They repaired the cabin, chinking the logs with mud and moss to keep out the wind, building a new stone fireplace that became the warm, beating heart of their small home. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, the silence between them a comfortable, living thing. The horrors of the world below seemed to fade, replaced by the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind in the pines. Here, stripped of their pasts, they were not a white rancher and an Apache outcast. They were just Eli and Tessa. He learned the rhythm of her movements, the cadence of her quiet breathing as she slept beside him on a bed of pine boughs and firs. She learned the landscape of his face, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the deep lines of pain around his mouth easing for the first time. It was a period of healing, of two broken pieces learning how they might fit together to make something whole. But peace, they both knew, was a fragile thing. Fear was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. The first snows dusted the highest peaks, a beautiful, stark reminder that winter was coming. The season of survival was upon them, and their small store of food and firewood felt inadequate against the coming cold. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every distant animal cry, would make them both start, their hands reaching for the weapons that were never far away. The ghosts of their pasts were not gone. They were simply waiting, biding their time down in the valley. The intrusion, when it came, was not from the white world, but from Tessa's. Two Apache scouts appeared at the edge of their clearing one morning, materializing from the trees as if from the earth itself. They were not hostile, but their faces were grim. They carried no weapons, only a message. "Kaha has been cast out," one of them said, speaking in the Apache tongue, his eyes fixed on Tessa, pointedly ignoring Eli. "A new chief has risen. His name is Geronimo. He preaches a new war. He calls all the people to him, to drive the White Eyes from our lands forever." Tessa's body went rigid. Geronimo. The name was a legend, a firebrand, a symbol of the last, desperate resistance of her people. "He has heard the story of the daughter of the people who lies with a white man," the second scout continued, his voice hard. "He has declared you a traitor to the blood. Your life is not safe, not even in these mountains. His warriors will hunt you as they hunt the deer." The message delivered. They turned and melted back into the forest, leaving a cold dread in their wake. Tessa's act of mercy, her choice of love over hate, had now earned her a death sentence from the very people she had once called her own. She was truly an outcast, a woman with no nation, no tribe, no home. That night, the fear in the cabin was a palpable thing, a third presence sitting with them by the fire. Eli looked at Tessa's face, saw the profound despair in her eyes, and his heart broke. He had asked her to share his world, and in doing so, he had helped destroy what was left of hers. "We can leave," he said, his voice urgent. "We can leave the territory altogether. We can go north, to Oregon, or east, past the Mississippi. We can find a place where no one knows our names, where the past can't find us." It was a tempting offer, a vision of a new life, a clean slate. Tessa looked at him, at the earnest, desperate hope on his face. He was willing to give up everything, to become a nameless wanderer. For her. The depth of his love was a profound, humbling thing, but to run would be to surrender. It would be to admit that the hate of the world was stronger than they were. It would be to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the weary lines around his eyes. "I don't run," she said, her voice soft but filled with a new, unshakable resolve. "I have been running my whole life. From the soldiers, from the ghosts, from myself. I will not run anymore." She took a deep breath, her gaze becoming clear and focused. "I heal what I can." A decision was made in the quiet of that mountain cabin. They would not run, they would return. They would go back to the valley, to the ashes of the McCrae Ranch, and they would build something new. Not for his father, not for his legacy, but for themselves. The journey back down the mountain was the opposite of their journey up. They were not fleeing a world, but returning to face one. When they rode into the ruined ranch yard, it was as if no time had passed. The blackened skeleton of the barn still stood, a monument to Hollister's hate. The poisoned well was still capped. The place was a graveyard of dreams. But this time, they did not see only the destruction. They saw the good bones of the house. They saw the rich earth that, with a clean well, could be made to live again. They saw the endless sky and the solid, reassuring presence of the mountains. They saw a home. They started the next day, the work of punishing, all-consuming therapy. They tore down the remains of the barn, salvaging what good timber they could. They began the long, back-breaking process of digging a new well. Eli working the shovel and pick, Tessa hauling up the buckets of dirt. They were a team, their movements falling into a natural, efficient rhythm, their shared purpose a silent bond between them. A few days into their work, a wagon rumbled up the lane. It was Peterson, the blacksmith, a man whose opinion carried weight in the town. He stopped his wagon, his face impassive. He looked at Eli, then at Tessa, who stood beside him, her hand not leaving the shovel she held. "Heard you were back," Peterson said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the back of his wagon, which was loaded with new lumber and a heavy cast-iron pump for a well. "Figured you might need this." Eli was stunned into silence. I can't pay you for this, Peterson." The blacksmith shrugged his massive shoulders. "It ain't a gift. It's a loan. You pay me back when you can." He looked Eli square in the eye. "A man who stands his ground like you did. A man who stands by his own. No matter what others say, he deserves a chance to rebuild." His gaze flickered to Tessa for a fraction of a second. And while there was no warmth in it, there was a grudging respect. He wasn't helping because he had accepted her, but because Eli had. He tipped his hat and drove away, leaving the lumber and the pump in the dusty yard. He was the first. A few days later, another neighbor, a quiet farmer from the next valley over, left a sack of seed corn on their porch without a word. The town was not embracing them, but it was watching, and in the stubborn, defiant act of their rebuilding, some of its people saw a reflection of the same grit and determination that had settled this harsh land in the first place. The final test came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Eli and Tessa were laying the foundation for a new, smaller barn when they saw the riders. It was Kaha, and with him were a half-dozen armed Apache warriors, their faces painted for a fight. They rode into the yard and formed a silent, menacing half-circle around the two of them. Eli's hand went to his Colt, but Tessa put a restraining hand on his arm. This was her fight. She stood up straight and tall, her shovel still in her hand, and faced the man who had once been her betrothed. "You are not welcome here, Kaha," she said, her voice ringing with a strength that belied her small frame. "Geronimo has spoken," Kaha said, his voice cold. "He says you are a traitor. He says you must be brought to him for judgment. We have come to take you." "I am not going anywhere," Tessa said. She took a step forward, her eyes blazing with a fire Kaha had never seen before. "I am not a traitor. I am a woman who chose to save a life instead of watching another one be wasted. I chose a man who showed me kindness over a people who offered me nothing but a path to an early grave. I chose him," she said, her voice rising with passion as she gestured to Eli. "And I choose again, here, now, on this land, which is my land as much as it is his. This is my home. If you want me, you will have to kill me on it." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the ruined barn. The warriors looked from Tessa to Kaha, their expressions uncertain. They had come for a traitor, a weak woman who had been seduced by the enemy. They found a warrior queen, standing her ground, defending her home. Kaha stared at her, his face a torrent of conflicting emotions. He saw the girl he had known, but he also saw the unyielding woman she had become. He saw her love for the white man standing beside her, a love that was not a weakness, but a source of incredible strength. He had come to enforce a law of hate, and he was being faced with a power he did not understand. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle he was holding. He looked at Eli, a long, searching gaze that judged and measured him. Finally, he turned his eyes back to Tessa, a deep, profound sadness entering his expression. "Then I hope he deserves you," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that was for himself, for his people, for a world that was lost forever. He turned his horse and, without another word, he and his men rode away, leaving behind not peace, but a hard-won, bitter truce. That evening, as the sun set, painting the desert sky in breathtaking shades of purple and orange, Eli came to Tessa as she stood by the newly dug well. The frame of the new barn stood behind them, a skeleton of hope against the twilight. In his hand, he held a small, simple ring, a plain band of silver he had bought from a traveling tinker weeks ago, before the fire. He took her hand, her calloused, strong hand that had saved his life and helped him rebuild it. He placed the ring in her palm. "You saved my ranch," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Now I owe you more than gold." Tessa looked down at the simple band, then up at his face, her eyes shining in the fading light. A small, slow smile touched her lips. She closed her hand around the ring and whispered, "Then promise me this land will be ours." He pulled her into his arms, and they embraced beneath the same desert sky that had once tried to break them. The land stretched out around them, silent and vast. They were no longer enemies, no longer outcasts, no longer alone. They were home. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in English.